where Muslims and Buddhists come together to deliberate and formulate practical applications of religion and science to pressing issues that we face in ecology and sustainability. I would like to once again acknowledge the organizers of this conference, the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, or ISTAC IIUM, the Muslim Youth Movement of Malaysia, ABIM, Vajrayana Buddhist Council of Malaysia, VBCM, Theravada Buddhist Council of Malaysia, TBCM, Tibetan Buddhist Culture Center of Malaysia, TBCC, and the International Students of Islamic Psychology, ISIP. Thank you to our organizers for having the vision and compassion in organizing this crucial and timely conference in the face of current environmental threats to planet Earth and the ecology. We have a truly international panel of speakers and moderators who are subject matter experts in the fields of religion, ecology, and sustainability. So please do stay with us for the entire day. Before we go into the first session's topic for today, we are pleased to announce that the same meeting link will be used for the entire day, and you may remain in the meeting without having to leave or rejoin for subsequent sessions. Also, please note that all participants have been muted when joining the meeting. The Q&A session will be held after both speakers have completed their presentations. During the Q&A, please use the raise hand function in Zoom to indicate that you wish to ask a question. The host will then request you to unmute, upon which you must click on the unmute button to unmute yourself. You may then verbally ask your question. After you ask the question, the host will mute you, or you may mute yourself. You may also ask questions by using the chat function in Zoom. For our audience who are watching in Facebook Live, you may also post questions in the comments. However, do note that priority will be given to those who ask verbally in the Zoom session. Welcome to the first topic of today. For this session 4, we have 2 speakers with the following topics. Speaking on the topic Education on Environmental and Ecological Consciousness will be Muslim speaker Professor Dr. Faridah Abdul Manaf from Malaysia, and speaking on the topic Practical Approaches to Sustain Planet Earth will be Buddhist speaker Dr. David Loy from the USA. The Q&A will be chaired by, the session actually will be chaired by moderator Puan Suhaila Muhammad. I now have the pleasure of introducing Puan Suhaila. Puan Suhaila Muhammad is a program associate at the Southeast Asia Ministers of Education Organization Central Region for Special Education Needs. She is also currently pursuing her studies in special education at the Faculty of Education, University of Malaya. There, she is given the responsibility as the president of University of Malaya UNESCO Club and the head of Bureau for Welfare and Social Work. An avid volunteer, Puan Suhaila is with the National Association of Special Education Malaysia, Alliance of Children with Cerebral Palsy, and Pan Disability Football Malaysia. And now, without much further ado, I hand over to Puan Suhaila Muhammad to continue the session. Over to you, Puan.
Thank you, Brother Suling Tong, for the very kind introduction. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh, and greetings everyone. Salam sejahtera and welcome to Islam Buddhism Dialogue, Eco Dialogue IBED Conference from 15 to 16 January 2022. A conference on the application of religion and science to ecology and sustainability perspectives from Islam and Buddhism. My name is Suhaila Muhammad, and it is my greatest pleasure to be the moderator for Topic 4, Education on Environmental and Ecological Consciousness, Practical Approaches to Sustain Planet Earth. This conference is definitely timely and well worth attending, particularly on the environmental sustainability, which is our responsibility in interacting with the planet to maintain natural resources and avoid jeopardizing the ability for future generations to meet their needs. And for this topic, we have two very prominent speakers on this subject, Professor Dr. Faridah Manaf and Dr. David Loy. Firstly, allow me to introduce our first distinguished speaker, Professor Dr. Noor Faridah Abdul Manaf. Prof. Noor Faridah was the former Deputy Rector of Internalization and Global Network at International Islamic University Malaysia, IIUM. She has been teaching English literature at International Islamic University for 32 years. She is widely published in the areas of English literature, Islam, and has written articles on environment in local newspapers. Prof. Faridah is also the former Vice President of IMAN, an NGO of Muslim women professionals, who is also active in interfaith and cross-cultural relations and has been involved in organizing conferences in this area. She has also organized and co-organized environment-related events both in Kota Damansara, where she lives, and at IIUM, where she teaches events, namely World Environment Day, River Project, Earth Hour, and many more. Professor Noor Faridah is a Fulbright Scholar at Cornell University, New York in 2007 and Mevlana Visiting Scholar at Seljuk University in Konya, Turkey in 2018. She is also a published bilingual creative writer who has won some writing awards in Malaysia. Her poetry, books, The Art of Naming a Muslim Woman's Journey, and travel poetry were published in 2016 and 2019 respectively. She is now working on completing a history novel on the Rawas. And last but definitely not least, Prof. Dr. Faridah is also the Board of Governor for Senior Regional Center for Sufficiency, Economy Philosophy for Sustainability, Senior SEPS, representing Malaysia. Now, without further ado, please welcome Professor Noor Faridah Abdul Manaf on education on environmental and ecological consciousness, practical approaches to sustain planet Earth from the Muslim perspectives. Professor Noor Faridah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to meet Suhaila again. You know, we met like a week ago, I think, on a similar sustainable kind of event with Portuguese dancer online. We were doing workshop online for children with special needs. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure. You know, after yesterday's session, I'm like, what is there left to say? But I think it'd be good to continue the conversation on Islamic ecology, Buddhism perspective, and all that. So my topic, can we have the slide? I would like somebody to control the slide from the other side. Now, before I move forward with what I have to say this morning, I would like to point out that I have changed the terminology slightly. Ecological consciousness to ecological literacy. I think two different things. You know, after listening to the talk by Dr. Osman, I think they have two different meanings. Yeah, but for today's purpose, I will use the term ecological literacy because I think if we look at it as a need to inform, you know, to educate ourselves, perhaps, you know, the field will be taken seriously. All of us would not like to be seen stupid or illiterate. So if we say that you need to be educated in this field, you need to be ecological literate, perhaps people would take this seriously. So it's just like, you know, health literacy, ecological literacy, religious literacy. That term literacy brings him more meaning, you know, more sense of urgency. So I would like to refer that as such. Yeah. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Now, my talk outline is as follows. You know, I would like to go back to remind all of us, even after yesterday's session, I think by now we are like, what is there left, to learn. But I think the question of why is ecological literacy important must be continually addressed. And then, of course, I will take a different take, not much different from Dato Osman, because I'm really, a student of his as well. Because, yesterday's book arrived timely, Dato. His latest book, Environmental Wisdom for Planet Earth, it arrived yesterday, and I was reading it all night. And I think it tallies because much of the theme that I would like to address comes from two eminent scholars, Syed Hussein Nasser, who was a teacher of Dato Osman Bakar, and he addressed a lot of his thoughts on environment in this book. And I was also looking at the idea of the connectivity between nature, man, and God. So the stress will be on that. So I'm very happy that Dato is here, and after yesterday's talk, I think there's a lot more to do out of the philosophy on ecology and environment in Islam, just based on Syed Hussein Nasser's thought. But I also look at Syed Najib Al-Attah's thought on this, not that much difference from Nasser, but it's still good to discuss the differences and similarity. I will also look at past and current practices in Islam and Muslim countries, Malaysia, Indonesia as dominant Muslim populated countries, Iran practices in minority Muslims in UK, South Africa, Zanzibar, and Tanzania, best practice by Muslim communities and society in these countries. And finally, is how do we build ecological literacy among our youth, and in so doing, how do we extend that to the public in general? And of course, the conclusion. Can we move on next? So why is ecological literacy important? As so impressed yesterday, the whole day, all afternoon, we have only one planet. And from Islamic perspective, taking care of the ecosystem is an amanah. Amanah is a Malay word for trust. But this kind of trust is connected to divinity, the trust placed upon us by Allah. Islamic perspective is that the earth is an amanah, from Allah to us. And I think Prof. Dato Osman mentioned this yesterday. Our role as Caliph, and part of the task is to look after our planet. So what is ecological literacy? It is having an understanding of and respect for the ecosystem, and to create sustainable relationship between human communities and the natural surroundings. So it's not a one-way traffic. There's this bond between us, nature, just not that bond to the creator as well. So you've got this triangle, environment, God, mankind. Next, please. So Islamic perspective next. Yesterday's talk, Quranic ecology. It's Prof. Osman mentioned a lot of sources from Quranic verses. I will look at the hadith aspect in a bit, but taking the thought and philosophy of Syed Hussein Nasser, he actually wrote about the importance of the environment as far back as 1960s. And his book, Man and Nature, that had a great impact. Even Francis, in this book, and Dato mentioned that Pope Francis actually wrote in 2015 an encyclical letter Laudato Si, or Si, of the Holy Father Francis on the care of our common home. He took much of Nasser's philosophy on environment out of that book, Man and Nature. And Nasser was frequently a visitor at the Vatican. So he was a common visitor to talk at the Vatican on this subject. So a lot of impact, and he was writing about this, the ecological crisis way back in the 60s, right? And for him, nature has its own divinity connection, and we cannot separate that from physical and material world, which secular modern man is focused on. Can you go back? Yeah. So nature should be respected and must not dominate. Yeah, it must not be dominated. I think Dr. What's her name? Damanda, is it? She spoke about this as well in yesterday's session, that we should not dominate. And she was against the concept of man and nature, but man within nature. So we must not dominate. I cannot see the, okay. All right, so and I think this is prevail in teachings of Christianity, Buddhism, and of course in Islam. Can we go next, please? Next slide. So Prof. Nasir in 1990 said that, we all know, he knew way back in the 60s that there has been a disharmony between man and nature. We admit that, the relationship is not that good, and but we don't admit to the fact that when there's this equilibrium, it's due to the destruction of the harmony between man and God. We kind of like ignore that the real cause is because we have moved away from our ties with God, with Allah, yeah. And if if our relationship is not taken care of, that, and therefore chaos will take place in the other form, yeah. So the basic line is take care of your relationship with God, and then the rest will fall in its place. Next, please. So he's a Sufi guy, so that kind of relationship, your ties with Allah is always stressed on. And I think the concept of Tawhid mentioned by Datuk yesterday is really the core argument. The Tawhid, starting from the name of Allah, yeah, Al-Wahid. So basically the underlying philosophy is that. Now looking at Prof. Said Muhammad Naqib Al-Atas, he also believed that nature is part of the cosmos, and the opposite meaning of that is chaos, which means that nature has its own system and balance, and that is always in harmony with the will of Allah, right? With the coming of secularism, which started in Europe, this has disrupted the balance in nature. And by that, Al-Atas stress on loss of adab, which means that when justice is not placed in the proper place, you invite chaos again. Now, when nature is not where it should be, i.e. respected, understood properly in accordance to Sharia, if we do not pay to this attention, do not pay attention to this, then imbalance will occur. Next, please. So, Prof. Osman spoke of Quranic verses, but I would like to look at some hadiths from Bukhari and Muslim with regard to environment. The first one is like, we are reminded that when we plant a tree or sow a field, when human or bird or animal eats from it, it is considered a charity. So you are rewarded, yeah, and that rewarded in the hereafter. Allah will take note of this, that whatever you plant, even the tree giving shade, yeah, you still be rewarded. And if you plant fruits and all that, and animals come and eat, it is still charity. You'll be rewarded as well, right? So don't kill the animals or chase them away, because that is a form of sadaqah. If the day, and that in the next hadith, if the day of resurrection comes upon any one of you while he's seedling in his hand, let him plant it. So even if, you know, calamity, doomsday is here, you are still watering your plant or planting, finish the job. So that's how important it is. Yeah. Now, there's also a story of the fourth caliph, Ali Abi Talib, who advised
Recording in progress.
Who advised a man who wanted to reclaim an abandoned land. So the caliph told him, partake of it gladly, so long as you are a benefactor, not a despoiler, a cultivator, not a destroyer. So if you take care of the land, you know, take it. You know, there's no argument there. Caliph Abu Bakr, the first one, when he was going to war in Syria, his instruction was very clear. Do not harm women, children, the infirm, and don't harm animals, crops, or cut down trees while in war. So respect for nature, right? Next, please. Next slide. Right, and then there was a story about this man who was thirsty, so he quenched his thirst and then saw an animal, a dog. He went down again to the well and fed him with water in his shoes. So the Prophet said, Allah was pleased with that, and the people of the Messenger of Allah, peace be upon him, said, "O Messenger of Allah, is there a reward for us in serving the animals?" The Prophet said, yes. There is a reward for serving any living thing, yeah, including animals. Next, please. So I'm going to look at some samples of past and current practices in Islam Muslim countries. Please, next. We look at Iran, Zanzibar, Tanzania, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Africa, and Muslim minority in UK. Next. So in Malaysia, they've got many national education plans. In 2017, they introduced this Dasar technology hijau, green technology. And, you know, ministries were advised, especially Ministry of Education, to advise to adapt, to change their curriculum and include green-based curriculum. But I was talking to a few teachers. I said, how much or what is the extent of this? Yeah, they don't have a full-blown course on environment education, although environment education is not a new thing. Yeah, I was tracing the history of it. The ESD, or Education for Sustainable Development, you know, it started way back in Malaysian Third Plan, 1976 or 1980. It only resurfaced after Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit in 1992. So environmental education was introduced in 1988 by a structured curriculum, but we don't see the consistency of it. I was checking with a few friends last night and this morning, you know, how much, what is the extent of this in your curriculum? It's here, there, and everywhere, but not a full-blown course or subject. It's there in Form 2 civics. It's there, some of it in science subject, English, basically touch and go, right? In activities, I mean, it's very trending to have gardens, sustainable gardens in schools. That has been going on for a long time. But I think it's not discussed enough, it's not taught enough, right? But the policy is there. Perhaps this is something that we can follow up after this conference, whereby, you know, I would suggest, you know, having another session with teachers, MPs, so that we cover all walks of life, not just religious people and academics. Now, the 11 and 12 Malaysian plan, the blueprint encourages local universities to also collaborate with the industries on green technology. And my university's own experience. I can only quote that. I'm sure it's also done in other universities, whereby we introduce in our Islamic finance course the stress on green sukuk and so on. And we've got a Sejahtera academic framework of SAF incorporated both in our curriculum and co-curriculum. So IIUM, University where I'm at, was the first Malaysian and Islamic university to win the Green Gown Award in 2020 for Best Sustainable Institution category. There are many green initiatives in achieving the 17 SDG goals, but we align it to Maqasid Sharia. Next, please. This is Yusaimi here. Yusaimi, are you here? I'm citing his NGO. He was our moderator yesterday. But Yusaimi has got this green NGO, RAS Malaysia, Malaysian Peaceful Environment Organization, and Laskar Alam is a training module which the NGO introduces here to develop a group of environmental activists. Yusaimi has been doing this for a long time. Sometimes we invite him to run workshops, recycling, the 3Rs and all that. So he would emphasize on the modules, would emphasize on environmental theology, sustainable science, environmental morality, with additional skills appropriate to each level. I was hoping he's here so he can share with us some of the practices done by his group. Next, please. So going to Indonesia, Indonesia is a success story when it comes to environment and so on. We had a webinar session with them last year, and one of the ulamas was saying that their majlis had issued fatwas to ensure the control of deforestation. So that's nice. Whereby fatwa, with Muslims, we've got fatwa, we respect it, But I think that's a way forward. I think Malaysia is yet to follow that, And their pesantren, in their pesantren, religious schools, usually it's always associated with, okay, you just memorize Quran, blah, blah, blah. But in recent years, they are much more sophisticated than that, in which the Ministry of Environment, in collaboration with Ministry of Religious Affairs, recently signed MOU to launch program on eco-pesantren that combine the teaching of Islam, Tafizul, Quran with environmental concern curriculum. So what do they do? These some of the green-based projects at the pesantren include gardens at every land around the building, vertical garden, roof garden, garden and farm, sustainable. Now, there's also effort of collaboration between Majlis Ulama. I was telling you about this, how they issue fatwa on environment. And the idea is to educate the mass, with Islamic teaching, so you don't separate, between concerns of the world and religious belief. Right, next. In Iran, you've got Green Front of Iran, an environmental NGO, which has initiated effort to seek amalgamation between Islamic teaching. Again, the concept is different. You don't separate, religion and problems of the day. So there's a lot of use of Quranic and Hadith to promote green message and concern for the environment. So they would also impress upon the imams, because imams, the imam system, the imamate, they've got great influence on the society. So they also educate them there. Going to United Kingdom, yesterday I think one of the sisters mentioned that her interest was to visit Cambridge, the Green Mosque, which has just been established. Green effort is also done through Islamic teaching. The maktab teaches religious values, yeah, while indirectly mentions the concern on environment care and love towards nature in their curriculum. Next, please. Going to South Africa, Zanzibar, and Tanzania. So the concept is still the same, you know, extensive nationwide green school program, you know, to teach young and old, to encourage them to care for the environment, and a lot of eco-Islamic initiative, not just of the land, but also marine conservation. Next, please. So, as mentioned yesterday, a lot of verses on environment care, and Baqarah 60, verse 60 mentioned this: do not commit abuse on the earth, spreading corruption. Next, we are constantly reminded, yeah, take care of your environment, take care of your surrounding, because as mentioned, yeah, by Dr. Osman and repeated again in his new book, Environmental Wisdom for Planet. I really would recommend you to buy this book. You know, it's really conclusive. I mean, it's comprehensive. You know, the environment is an open book. It's God's language to us. In Islam, God speaks to us in two ways. One, through the Quran, and the other is through the environment, nature. You know, he created so many things. What is he trying to tell us? Think, you know, he's talking to us. Think about his mightiness, his merciness, his mercifulness, his compassion, his art, you know, because I'm from literature and all that. Great art. And that should bring us to his supremacy. The fourth area of concern is how do we build the how? You know, we talked about, we define our problem, the what, but now it's the how. How do we build ecological literacy among our youth and the public in general? Next, please. Now, I would like to bring you to this attention to this book, right, published in 2013, entitled Eco-Literate, How Educators Are Cultivating Emotional, Social, and Ecological Intelligence by Daniel Goleman, Lisa Bennett, and Zinio Bardo, yeah, from the Center for Eco-Literacy. And they outline 5 steps that need to be done. The first one is we have to develop empathy for all forms of life. You don't care for something you don't love and you don't empathize with. So we have to engage the young, the old with this sense of empathy. How do we do that? With the children, it's easier. They love books and illustration. So we can start with that with the younger kids. Yeah, and you can show them videos of animals where they are suffering and then engage them with feelings and emotion. How do you feel? What do you think? And so on and so forth. There's also a suggestion for direct contact with living things, like keep live plants and animals in the classroom, take them out to nature areas, you know, natural areas, zoos, botanical gardens. We don't do this, especially, you know, living in the urban, where in Malaysia, for example, in Kuala Lumpur, we lock up our children. Very rare we take them out. But listening to our sister in Canada yesterday, where they go hiking in winter and all that, that's really good. You know, keeping children in touch with nature. You keep nature out of their life, they become something else. You know? So I think this is something that educators in developing countries should take note of. Don't lock up your children, take them out. Now, also another approach is to turn the classroom into ocean habitat, right, with coral, jellyfish, and so on. You could put an aquarium there, or if not real animals, you know, at least pictures and symbols. Let them feel close to. There's a joke about Singaporean children whereby they don't know the sound of a cow, goat, and so on. Yeah, because all they see are pictures. So sometimes these touch pet zoos are also important. I remember taking my own child to a pet zoo, and the first time she encountered chicken, she didn't know how to deal with that. You know, she just put it on. We put the chicken on her hand, and then she held it for a while, and then just throw it away, almost killing the poor thing. Next. Embrace sustainability as a community practice. Teach, yeah, needs to include real world encounters, so they can do this. We can give them practical, like going out, picking trash from roadside, cleaning the beach, and so on. Next, please. Hands-on experience, yeah. Make the invisible visible. So for example, if you're teaching them on climate change, show them facts, show them documentaries on how humans are disrupting the ecology, the ecosystem. Use Google Earth, travel virtually. They could also contact students on the other side of the globe or neighboring country and talk about this. Perhaps, one of the things that we can do, and it was suggested yesterday by Dr. Dharmendra, I think, that we need to continue this networking, bringing it to practice. So perhaps our students can talk to each other. In fact, I think the next conference should be the young one talking about caring for environment. Yeah, let them voice out their ideas and their creativity, talking about how would they inherit this planet from us? What would they do to save it? Next, please. Anticipate unintended consequences. We also have to teach them what happens when you use things, resources excessively, using extra water, using plastic bag, how that can impact the environment. We can create games, video games, to show the negative influence. Next. Understanding how nature sustains life. So what do you do here? I think you should impress on them to take only what is needed. I think the Quran is full of this message. I allow you to eat animal, but don't eat excessively. God said we created all these animals, cow, cattle, whatever, for you, either as transport or as food, as pet, whatever. But don't do things excessively. When you eat meat, don't, like every day you have to eat it, right? That's why when you eat excessively, you get all sorts of illnesses, because it's a way of God talking back to us. Don't do things in excessiveness. Now, the other thing is also, to what is recommended here is to give them home lesson, to note down everything they eat and drink, so that they know how much they take from nature just for food or drinks, and to create that awareness. And eco-literate or environmentalists can also be invited to class and teach them how to lead. I think this is important. You need to invite people, experts, to your classroom to educate. Always hear it from the knowledgeable. Next. Conclusion. I think this is it. My conclusion is that to remind us all that we only have one planet, and it is a divine trust on us to care for it. The destruction of nature is a reflection of our own ties with God, our ties with nature, our respect for one another. And the way forward is to teach ecological literacy from young. Start young. And of course, religious consciousness has to come in, has to be incorporated in that learning. Lastly, a world where God is absent will be chaotic. Thank you so much for your indulgence in listening to me.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. Faridah, for the highly significant points and views. I think the key takeaway points that Prof. Faridah is focusing on is the significance on ecological literacy, which needs to be continuously addressed, and our roles as Caliph. It's not like a one-way traffic that requires our understanding and respect for the ecosystem. And also another point from Dr. Faridah is to take care of our relationship with God and not to segregate the teachings of religion and the worldly matters, particularly pertaining to environmental issues. Right, Prof. Dr. Faridah? So thank you so much for your sharing. There'll be more later during the Q&A session, inshallah. And now, I would like to introduce our second distinguished speaker for today. And for those who have just joined us, welcome and selamat datang to of Islam Buddhism Eco Dialogue, entitled Education on Environmental and Ecological Consciousness Practical Approaches to Sustain Planet Earth. We have heard the views from the Islamic perspectives by our first speaker, Prof. Dr. Faridah Manaf. Now it is my greatest honor to introduce another prominent speaker for this topic, Dr. David Lloyd. Okay, Dr. David Lloyd is a professor of Buddhist and Comparative Philosophy. His BA is from Carleton College, Minnesota, USA, and he studied analytic philosophy at King's College, University of London, UK. His master's degree is from the University of Hawaii in Honolulu, and his PhD is from the National University of Singapore. A prolific writer and global Buddhist speaker, Dr. David is the author of many books, including Eco Dharma, Buddhist Teachings for the Ecological Crisis, by Wisdom Publications 2019. He is one of the founding members of the New Rocky Mountain Eco Dharma Retreat Center, New Boulder, Colorado. Dr. David is especially concerned about social and ecological issues. A popular recent lecture is Healing Ecology, Perspectives on the Eco-Crisis, where he argues an important parallel between what Buddhism says about our personal predicament and our collective predicament today in relation to the rest of the biosphere. Hello, Dr. David. How are you? We are sorry to hear about the sudden death of your family today, and our heartfelt condolences from everyone at IBED. Now it is an honor to invite Dr. David Lloyd to share his views from Buddhist perspectives. Dr. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, first of all, for that very kind introduction. Let me just check. Can everyone see and hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you well and we can see you clearly.
Great, good. Thank you. You know, let me start by just saying I really appreciate this opportunity, and I'm really delighted that this conference is being held. I mean, truly, there is no more important topic in the world today than the ecological crisis. And having a conference that looks at this from an interreligious point of view just seems to me absolutely essential. So I'm really delighted and grateful to be a part of it. Thank you. I'm also sorry to say that due to some family issues, as you mentioned, I've been unable to attend the other sessions. So I just hope that what I have to say won't be repeating something that was already said. I would like to begin with something that I heard about a year ago. It is a statement by an American intellectual named Noam Chomsky, very well known. And he said in an interview something quite striking, something quite important. He said that this is the most important, no, I think he said dangerous. This is the most dangerous moment in human history. Please think about that for a moment. This is the most dangerous moment in human history. I'm a bit of a history buff. I like reading about history, so I tried to think of a counterexample, and I couldn't. I think he's right. There are many issues here. He's concerned about the fragility of democracy, about the danger of nuclear war, but clearly the most critical issue here is the ecological crisis, right? And again, please notice that I don't say the climate crisis, because urgent though that is, that's just the tip of a much larger ecological challenge that includes, for example, the loss of biodiversity, the fact that so many plant and animal species are disappearing so fast, and many, many other issues, loss of forests and agricultural land, increasing pollutants in the air, in the sea, in the earth, and our bodies, and many, many other issues along the same line. Clearly, I think Chomsky is right in the sense that what we do or don't do in the next few years is likely to have very great repercussions for many generations, probably many centuries. And so you could say the realization that he points to, in a way, it changes everything, or it should change everything in terms of how we approach the world, including how we understand and practice our own religion. What does it mean to be a Muslim or a Buddhist today? Here I'm reminded of two of my favorite Zen stories. My own practice tradition is Japanese Zen. In the first story, the Chinese Chan master, Unman, was asked by one of his students, what is the fruit of a lifetime of practice? In other words, what is it after all of these years of practice of meditation and so forth? What do we gain from that? And his answer was quite striking. He simply said, responding appropriately. You could say the goal of our practice is not to transcend or escape this world, but rather to realize our interdependence with each other and with the earth, to realize that therefore my own well-being is not separate from your well-being or the well-being of everyone or the well-being of the earth. And so the true fruit of spiritual practice, I believe, is that we are able to respond appropriately to whatever situation we find ourselves in today. And as Chomsky said, the situation we find ourselves in today is very urgent, very critical, very dangerous. The second story relates to this. Another Zen student asked a Zen master, what should we do when difficult times come? And the master replied, this is a little hard to show on Zoom, but the master held up his arms and he said, welcome, welcome, welcome them. In other words, our path is not about avoiding difficult times. It's about responding appropriately to them. And when we do that, that seems to be the time when we are most transformed, right? It's not simply that in doing that, we are doing the best we can to help a situation, but it also is an essential part of our own spiritual practice. I really feel the need to emphasize this because, at least in the Buddhist world, there are still many people who think that social engagement, ecological engagement is a distraction from the real practice, which in Zen, we tend to think of as meditation. In fact, it's not that way at all, that our engagement with the world is all the more evidently today an essential part of our practice. The Buddha lived in a very different time and place than us. He lived in Iron Age India about 2,400 years ago. And so we can't simply turn to the original Buddhist texts, the Pali Canon, or all the other sutras that developed later and all the other Asian Buddhist traditions. We can't simply look to them for specific answers of what to do today. the situation that they developed in, it was so very different from ours, right? Nonetheless, there are very important implications that we can develop from those teachings. And what I would like to focus on today is what I think is the single most important implication, the single most important Buddhist teaching that I think can help us today. And this is quite simply the Bodhisattva path. Or as some people talk about it today in response to the ecological crisis, the Eco-Sattva path. Now, unfortunately, this has sometimes been understood in a sectarian way. There are some people in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition who, they think that they are superior to Theravada because they are following the Bodhisattva path. And again, I think that's a misunderstanding. We need to think of the Bodhisattva path in a non-sectarian way today as a model of how it is that we can live and respond to the great ecological crisis that we are facing today. Simply put, the Bodhisattva path has two sides or two aspects. You could say it's like the two sides of a coin. On the one hand, those who follow this path continue to work on their own personal spiritual transformation. For example, in Zen, we continue to meditate. We continue to work with a teacher, whatever. But at the same time, we realize that that by itself is insufficient. And I think we can see why that's the case. When Buddhists come to the Buddhist path and meditate, for example, we do so usually because there's some dissatisfaction in our own lives. There's something missing, something isn't quite right. And we feel that through Buddhism, we can cure ourselves, we can become more healthy. But as we practice Buddhism, perhaps the single most important fruit of that practice is the realization that we are not separate from other people. And therefore, in the process of following the path, that should automatically make us less self-preoccupied. And that includes preoccupation with our own equanimity, our own enlightenment. As we follow the Buddhist path, we feel more connected with other people and therefore naturally want to do what we can to make the world a better place for all of us. Traditionally, the Bodhisattva path has been understood in terms of, well, in a way, what I just said about we focus on our own spiritual practice, but then we go out and we help other people. But when we think about it in ecological context, I think we can expand that and understand it in the following way. In order to respond appropriately to the ecological crisis, there are things that we need to do individually and personally, but there are also things that we need to work together with other people to address because they are structural, because they are not things that we can resolve personally. We have to actually join together in order to address these structural challenges. Let me begin with the personal side, right? I mean, clearly, one important issue is reducing our own carbon footprint. And there are certain obvious things we can do to do that. I mean, one of them, as we know, transportation is a big issue, maybe most of all flying, aviation, but also even in terms of our cars. I mean, so one thing we can do is if insofar as we can avoid using personal cars and using personal transport, that can be very important. And insofar as we do have our own cars, we can shift to hybrid or even better to electric cars. I think that's one very good example. Another that's very popular here in the United States is solar panels. We can put these panels on our own roofs so we're able to generate our own electricity and not depend on the grid, which in most cases is creating electricity by burning fossil fuels. So these are a couple personal, individual things that we can do. Another very important one is, and this is sometimes overlooked, but very important, and I think especially in a Buddhist context, it has to do with our diet. It has to do with the kind of food that we eat. We know that a diet high in meat and dairy products is more carbon intensive than a diet that's more based on plant sources of protein and fruits as well. In other words, we can actually be reducing our carbon footprint by eating lower down on the scale, getting our protein and other things that we need less from animal products. And of course, this is especially important from a Buddhist standpoint, because animal products often involve suffering for the animals. And that has always been a major concern of Buddhism, to reduce the suffering, not only of ourselves and other human beings, but all living beings, as the previous speaker was also talking about. So by changing our diet and reducing the amount of meat and dairy products we eat, that can really have a very big consequence that also fits in with larger Buddhist principles. You know, the Buddha himself, he did not require the monastics, he did not require the bhikkhu and bhikkhuni to be vegetarian, but there was a very simple and good reason for that. They were basically dependent on begging for their food every morning. So, you know, there's a sense in which beggars can't be choosers, that they were, the Buddha said that they could eat what they were given as long as they did not know or suspect that it was killed for them. A very good principle for someone who is dependent on being given food by other people. But of course, it's important to realize that for most of us today, we have a lot of control over our own diet. And I think this shift away from a heavy meat and dairy diet to a more plant-based one is something that most of us can do rather easily. That the constraints against that are usually in our own mind rather than in our actual physical or financial situation, right? So those are some examples, and there are many more, of course. Those are examples of what we can do as individuals. But I think we also need to recognize that simply trying to respond appropriately to the ecological crisis by acting as individuals, that this has limitations. Here again, I'm reminded of another Buddhist story. It seems to me that in the last generation, at least here in the United States, I noticed that social engagement is more generally accepted by Buddhist practitioners, many of whom are converts, of course. And you could say that in a way, with things like hospice, Buddhist hospices, prison dharma, going into prisons and helping people learn how to meditate there, helping homeless people, all of these can be really good things to do. The analogy is we have become better in pulling drowning people out of the river. But we also need to look at the fact and to ask ourselves, why are there so many more people drowning in the river? What's happening historically? What's happening or maybe there's a different way, a more ecological version of this story. One very good thing we can do is go onto beaches and work together to pick up the incredible amounts of plastic that are now getting washed up because there's so much plastic in the ocean. This is very important. Nonetheless, if we think that this by ourselves is going to solve the problem of plastic pollution, it simply won't. There's too much plastic. There's more going in every day. We need to address the sources of plastic pollution and ask, Are there other ways for our economy to work that don't require on-disposable plastic, you see? We also need to look at that side of things as well. Let me pause for a second and ask a question here. What is the most popular religion in the world today? Please think for a moment. I think that it's not Christianity, it's not Islam, it's certainly not Buddhism. I think it's consumerism. If by a religion we mean what teaches us what's most important about the world and how to live in the world, I think the reality is for most people, it has become consumerism. Even for people who go to the mosque or the church or the temple one day a week, what are they doing the other 6 days of the week? What does it really mean to be following a spiritual path? What is it? You could say, what is it that really gives the meaning? Where do they find the meaning in our lives? And I think, frankly, for more and more people, it's consumerism. Advertising means that more and more people are converted. There's wonderful proselytizing through the advertising. And what does this mean for how we respond today? What I'm trying to point at here is raise some questions about the way that consumerism emphasizes never enough. And, you know, the classic word for that, never enough, is simply greed. The Buddha identified 3 poisons, sometimes called 3 fires, the 3 roots of evil. The basic idea being that when we are motivated by any or all of these, it creates difficulty, it creates bad karma, it creates problems for ourselves and for other people. And the 3 are greed, ill will, and delusion. Now, frankly, it seems to me that today we have a problem with these that didn't exist in the time of the Buddha, in the sense that we have institutionalized them. We don't have time to go into all the details, but let's just take a look at the first one, at greed. If greed means you never have enough, that you always want more, well, that's in a very important part of our economic system, isn't it? You can look at it from the 2 sides. You can look at it from the side of consumerism. Consumers never have enough, always want more. And how it is that through our spiritual practice, we can learn to develop a mind that is not dependent on consumption, that is able to find a serenity, a spiritual peace that doesn't require, you know, more and more and more consumption. But here's my point, important as that is, necessary as that is, we also need to look at the structural side, the institutional side. We have an economic system that frankly needs to grow if it's not going to collapse. We need to ask how much is the kind of economic, corporate, consumer economic system that we have today, how much is that a structural form of greed? And insofar as it is, I think we can see how this contributes to the ecological crisis. If our economic system needs to keep growing, if it's not going to collapse, what happens when that comes into conflict with a finite planet? The planet doesn't grow in that fashion. There's going to be a clash between the economic system and the planetary ecological system. And frankly, it seems to me that is what's happening now. That's the source of the ecological crisis. In order to address the institutional or the structural side, again, it's not enough. We don't simply do that as individuals. Because it's structural, that involves many institutions, we also need to work together with other people in order to address it in a meaningful way. It's interesting in Buddhism, and I guess I can only speak here for sure about American Buddhism. You'll have to decide if this is also true in the case of Malaysia. But you know, in Buddhism, we talk about the three treasures. The three treasures are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. That is to say, the teacher, the teachings, and the community of people who strive to follow those teachings. Well, what I notice here in the United States, to be quite frank, we have lots of teachers. We have lots of teachings. But I think where we tend to be weakest, maybe because we have very little of a monastic Sangha, where we tend to be weakest is in terms of Sangha. And therefore, in order to address the kinds of challenges we face here, one of the things that I think this is going to require is stronger Sanghas, that we need to come together more in a more focused way, you know, realizing that we depend on each other in many ways. And one of those ways that we're dependent on each other is in order to really have an impact on the economic and political system. It's interesting how what tends to draw people together is an external problem, right? I'm thinking about, say, World War II, the way that so many countries, and not only that, but the people, say the people in the US, the way that we came together. In a warlike situation, that's what brings people together. And I think, can't we look upon the ecological crisis as at least as serious as that? If we really understand what's happening, it really has enormous implications for encouraging us to come together and work together, because that's really the only way that we're going to be able to address it. And one reason I really appreciate this conference is, in this context, I think we all need to realize that the Sangha that Buddhism talks about, it's not just the Sangha of Buddhists, but it includes the Sangha of all spiritual people in all religious traditions, including, of course, Islam, that this is something that can bring us all together, that it can help us overcome whatever tendencies there are for sectarianism in order to work together. And frankly, that's what I find so inspiring about this gathering. Let me conclude by offering a particular kind of meditation, or how to call it, meditation mindfulness practice that I have found very helpful. You know, since I wrote the Eco Dharma book, sometimes I'm approached by people who say, you know, I really want to become engaged. I really want to become an eco-sattva. I want to do what I can, but I don't know what to do. What should I do? And what I tell them is, well, everyone is different. Everyone's situation is different and unique from other people's situation. So what I have found very helpful, what many of them have found very helpful, is this three-part meditation that I would like to close with. It's very simple. And, you know, we don't have time to do it in any depth, but I just want to mention the three meditations as something that people can do on their own. They can also be done in group too, but in general, I think mostly people do it as individuals, at least as a first time. Okay, 3 questions, 3 meditations. Number 1, what do I have to offer? What do I bring to the table? It may be that many of the things that I have to offer are just like anyone else. But it's also the case that I have my own unique situation, my own possibilities. So this involves a kind of really very sharp self-evaluation. What do I bring to the table? What are my skills? What are my networks? What are my, but I mean, we also need to consider our limitations. What's my age? What's my health? Am I retired? Do I need to earn money? What is my family situation? Are they depending on me to support them? I mean, we need to evaluate all these kinds of things and ask ourselves, you know, what do I have to offer? That's the first meditation. The second one turns outside and looks at our own situation and asks, given all the kinds of ecological issues there, all the kinds of problems that are out there, what can I focus on? What are the projects? I mean, there are too many possibilities, right? There are too many problems. If we try to do too much, we will spread ourselves too thin and probably have no impact at all. But if we can focus, then that can make a real difference. And this question is about how do we focus? How do we decide where we can have an impact? And that might even involve, you know, some research. Like here in Colorado, where I live, fracking is a very important thing. Natural gas fracking has become a very controversial issue. So this is something that many people become involved with. It's responsible for some very bad pollution, air pollution. And of course, as an example of fossil fuel, there are lots of other problems. Anyway, so those are the first two parts. Looking inside, what do I have to offer? Looking outside, what's needed? But the third one, and the culminating one, involves digesting the first two and then letting them go, forgetting them, as it were, because we have learned what we can. The third one involves asking ourselves, where does my heart want to go? What tugs at my heart? My heart, my love. And this is not a question that I think is simply about a rational answer, but it's more emotional, it's deeper. And it's important that it be deeper, because if it's really where our heart wants to go, it's likely that we're going to feel genuinely most engaged, do our best, and therefore be likely to have the most impact. So given that everyone's situation is different to some degree, this is what I would encourage everyone to do, because, and again, it's non-sectarian. This isn't a Buddhist meditation. In a sense, it has nothing particularly to do with Buddhism. Muslims can do it, Christians can do it, Jews can do it, everyone. But please reflect on these really important questions in response to the most dangerous moment in human history, the greatest crisis that humanity has ever faced. I think we all need to ask ourselves these questions. What do I have to offer? What is needed? And most of all, where does my heart want to go? And if we can do that, I think we are likely to have some real impact. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. David Loy. I'm speechless. Thank you so much for the highly significant points. I would like to highlight the key takeaway points that Dr. David Loy is focusing on, which is the true fruit of our religion and the goal of our practice is to realize their interdependence with one another and the earth, to respond appropriately. I will hold on to these two words, respond appropriately, which is really profound and a lot to digest. And also, in order to respond appropriately to ecological crises, particularly, we have to actually join together to address the structure as an essential part of our practice where we are most transformed. Right, and thank you for the questions of the David Loy, which are definitely something that needs to be pondered upon. What do I have to offer, which is inside of us, and given the ecological issues, what I can focus on, what are the projects that I can get involved in, which is outside, and as well to ask ourselves, where does our hearts want to go? Thank you so much. And thank you to Dr. David Loy and also Prof. Dr. Faridah, to both of our distinguished speakers for this session. Here we have come to our Q&A session. And for this Q&A session, I would like to read a message from the organizer. Okay, please use the raise hand function in Zoom to indicate that you wish to ask a question. And the host will then request for you to unmute, upon which you must click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. You may also then ask verbally your questions. After you ask the questions, the host will mute or you may mute yourself. You may also ask questions by using the chat function in Zoom. For our audience who are watching in Facebook Live, you may also post questions in the comments. Do note that priority will be given to those who ask verbally in the Zoom session. So I see here there are questions in the chat box. From Mr. Wilson to Dr. David Lloyd. Do you think we should slow down branding or marketing to slow down consumerism? That is the first question for Dr. David Lloyd. The floor is yours.
Yes. Okay. So I think we should slow down? Well, I think that is part of the necessary response to consumerism, right? Consumerism not only keeps us wanting more and more, but it also keeps us focused on the future. The basic thing that consumerism uses to grab us is the sense of insufficiency, all right? I don't have enough, something is missing, something isn't quite right. But if I can just get more sometime in the future, then everything will be okay. So it creates a kind of a future orientation, which becomes very problematical. And I think one of the very important things that both of our spiritual traditions emphasize, of course, is a kind of spiritual maturity and a kind of self-sufficiency where through our spiritual practice, we don't need to play that game anymore, that we find something right here and now in terms, whether we understand it in terms of a higher power or, we can conceptualize it in different ways, of course, but fundamentally this importance of realizing something about here and now that can help us escape this trap of always wanting more and more and in the future.
Yeah, can I also interrupt there? I don't think it's going to help because, I don't think it's going to change if you can't control yourself. So it's self-control. You can do all sorts of branding, reducing it, maximizing it, but it's you. It goes back to you. It goes back to the need to control our excessiveness. I think this is the bottom line. How much is enough? We just take what is only needed. So I think if we subscribe to that kind of philosophy, we cannot stop from consumerism. There's always this need. We need to eat. We need to travel. We need some kind of relaxation. We need holidays. That is not wrong in Islam, but what do you do in that kind of situation? Is it for yourself? Where are the others in that consumption? You share your food. Is it for yourself, your family? So I think the concept of spirituality also comes into it. What do you do with what you have? So I think that's it, Faridah. Yeah.
But then again, right, there's a fine line between greedy and wanting to develop oneself, wanting to oneself, so what is your take, Dr. David?
Well, let me say first of all that, I completely agree with Dr. Faridah that to live is to consume, isn't it? That's necessary. But to live only to consume, to see that as one's ultimate value and the meaning of one's life, that is where it becomes problematical. And of course, making that distinction isn't always that easy to do, especially when we are responsible for other people. But if we live to consume, then frankly, as I said in my talk, I think we end up making that into kind of the most important meaning in our lives, and it becomes a kind of a religion. And there's a real danger in that, I think. Yeah.
The main priority. Thank you, Dr. David Lloyd. So there's a Keshi Tashi Siri, your hand. Yeah, you would like to ask a question? because you raised your hand in the chat box. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I have a question both to the speakers. First, my question is Dr. Nur Faridah. Thank you for your amazing talk. I'm going to be a little bit devil in the going to ask. In your talk, you raised again and again, trust on Allah will help.
Yeah.
How can you take that kind of message to people who don't believe Allah? Because, we need to reach out to the people, Buddhist, Islam, Muslim, and outside religious people who don't have any.
Right.
How can we take our message to those if the core message is trust in Allah?
Yeah. But I think, even without that sense of belief, common sense of belief, the common values are there. As we do this engagement with this Buddhism and Islam, there are so many common values. I think we can start on that. At the end of it, what is the use of religion? Is to bring good, right? Out of, for yourself, for nature, for an environment. The end goal is that, right? But for Muslim, we believe in life hereafter. So that Allah is called to us as well, whereby we are accountable to Allah, right? But the end goal of religion is to bring goodness, for mankind, for nature and all that. I think if we can work together on that, the message is the same. And sometimes I feel that the question that I always ask is that why is the message the same from Adam to now? It must have come from the same source, right? Because we believe that in Islam, for every ummah, for every tribe, for every group of people, Allah sent messengers. In fact, I don't know whether Prof. Imtiaz will address this, but he has spoken a lot on that Buddha could have been one of the messengers of Allah, right? Even in Hinduism as well, because the core belief of Hinduism is one God, Rahman, Rahman. So I think, we respect systems of belief, but the core value, the shared universal values, I think this is the point of where we can work together. And I think our message should be that you hold hands together regardless.
So my question to Professor David Lloyd is this. As you mentioned, and I agree with that, we should not try to find answer always tracing back to the Buddhist sutra, because our current situation is very different from the Buddha's time. I agree with that. However, isn't it true the source, the origins of the current problem, individually and collectively, that we face, isn't the same? As you pointed out, 3 poisons: greed, and ill will, and ignorance. So therefore, finding the fundamental solution that's taught by the Buddha and subsequent Buddhist teachers from the different traditions, isn't it the same to deal with what we need to apply? That's my short question. And my another question to Dr. David is this. Quite often when we talk about solution, for example, you use, to sort out some of the ecological problem is, like a solar panel, like a, recently electric car. Sometimes that kind of solution is only to the selected people. In other words, middle class. Majority, like people who live in India, where I am now, these are the almost unreachable. So what is the solution to the majority people who do not have that kind of access, same time want to work to protect the ecology? So those are my 2 questions. Thank you.
Wonderful questions. Thank you for them. Yeah, there's so much packed into that. Regarding, well, would you mind if I just said something a little bit about your first question to Dr. Faridah? Because this issue of how it is that we speak to people who aren't interested in religion at all, how do we actually make a difference there? I think there's some recent discovery that is actually quite important. You know, Buddhism focuses on suffering, dukkha in the broadest sense, and there's a sense in which at the core of our suffering and at the core of our delusion is the delusion of a self, a separate self that's separate from other people and separate from the world. And consumerism, of course, is built on that sense of separation, built on trying to satisfy that individual self, a self that can never be satisfied. And the reason I highlight this is because something quite interesting has happened in the last generation. You have psychologists, economists, sociologists that are now releasing, they're doing these studies. They're doing studies not only of what makes people unhappy in psychology, they're also doing studies of happy people. What makes them happy? And what they're discovering is something really wonderful. After a fairly low minimum income, the really important issue is the quality of your relationships with other people. That's what makes people happy. And of course, that would not surprise the Buddha, that would not surprise Muhammad, right? But it's a really important insight that I wish would be taught in schools, the idea that how do we become happy? And we have these examples again and again and again. It's when we have really good relationships with other people, not consumerism, that makes people happy. So I guess I'm really excited about that. I wish that could be taught in schools. Regarding the three poisons, I agree completely. And in a way, that was kind of what my talk was about in part, right? So the Buddha has this wonderful analysis. He traces our problems back to when we are motivated, right? There's so much emphasis in Buddhism on motivation, on intention. And when we are motivated, when what we do is motivated by greed, ill will, delusion, that's when it creates unhappiness for ourselves and for other people. So I only had time to go into one example to talk about greed, but if we had more time, we could talk about the others and the way that they too, I think, have been institutionalized. I mean, just consider, for example, the media. Consider all the propaganda that we're getting from very powerful media. I think that is institutionalized delusion, and we can understand it in that form. So I guess all of this is a long way of agreeing with what you said, that I think analyzing our problem in terms of those three sources is completely right. Oh, now I'm embarrassed because I'm an old guy and I tend to forget. I've already forgot your third question. Can you just remind me very briefly what it was? I apologize.
My third question was, how can we, reach to the majority? Because using electric cars are the very, people who have enough money, but the people who don't have enough money can't do that. So they want to contribute to the ecology improvement.
Yeah. I mean, there's no point going on and on talking about reducing meat and dairy consumption of people who are so poor that they don't eat that now. I'm reminded of Gandhi, right? There are many people so poor, so hungry that God can only appear to them as a bowl of rice, and I think that's really important to acknowledge. To be honest, I do not have a good answer to that question, but I want to amplify the question because there's another factoid. There's another fact that I was quite shocked by recently. In the period between 1990 and 2015, 25 years, very recently, if we look at carbon footprint, the carbon footprint of the world's 1% was greater than the carbon footprint of the bottom 50% of the world's population. Not only that, it wasn't just greater, it was double. the top 1% are responsible for more emissions than the bottom 50%. And the way I understand that is the ecological crisis is also a class crisis. It's also an economic crisis, that we don't just simply solve the ecological crisis with the kind of economic system we have now that seems to promote a small number of rich people and immiserates many, many, many others. So I guess that's the conclusion I draw, is that the ecological and the economic crises are part of each other. Yeah, that's all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. David Law, and thank you for your questions. Those are very important questions that you asked, Gashi, Sari. Okay, I would like to get back to the questions in the chat box. Okay, from Mr. Chi Kyong Tan. Okay, to Dr. Faridah and Dr. Roy, I was so delighted that Dr. suggested that the next IBED conference should be led or delivered by the youngsters. Yes, it is timely. After all, the generation to come is going to manage the planet Earth with all the problems we have created for them. Recently, the Western world has started a new way of education for children, like the Big History Project pioneered by Bill Gates, and cosmic education in Montessori, which started with the Big Bang to narrate the 13.8 billion years history of the universe, Earth, and humanity. Could this kind of historical or cosmic narrative help in our children's ecological consciousness from the Islamic and Zen Buddhist perspectives? Is this where our hearts should go? That's a very good question. Thank you for the question. So I'll hand over the floor to Prof. Faridah.
Would David like to answer first while I try to process the question?
Okay, sure. Yeah. I think it's a wonderful question. And I think this is one of the really great challenges of our time, because this is one of the places where the spiritual and the scientific come together. You know, so often the issue of evolution has been understood in a very sectarian way, that this is where science and traditional religious stories conflict. And I think what this is pointing to is a really important possibility, that we can have a Buddhist and an Islamic perspective on the evolutionary process, that this is how Allah, or this is how Buddhism is acting in history, and I mean, just to express it in Buddhist terms, one way to understand, say, the enlightenment of the Buddha is the Buddha. Well, let me say it this way. After the Buddha's enlightenment, he was challenged by Mara, who is sort of the principle of evil or delusion. And Mara said to the Buddha, you know, why do you think you're enlightened? Who authorizes this enlightenment? Maybe it's just your delusion. And the Buddha, in reply, touched the earth with his hand, and he said, the earth is my witness. The reason I love that story is it's suggesting a very strong, deeper understanding of the earth. You know, so much of our problem is alienation from the earth. We feel separate from the earth. And to me, one of the really exciting things is to acknowledge that our species and the evolutionary development of our species is the development of the earth in us and through us, and that we don't have to make that kind of distinction. We don't have to understand the earth in a kind of a dead way, but we can understand it as a spiritual process, that this is how the spiritual is acting in history. And if we do it in that fashion, it implies a much deeper appreciation of the earth and all of the things that the earth has to offer.
Yeah, I agree with David here. In Islam, we are not against Big Bang Theory. In fact, it's mentioned in the Quran that the world started as one and then divided. Yeah. So I think, you know, science and religion must come together. In Islam, it's not an antithesis, regardless, despite what people say, that religion and science are always, bad sleeping partners. But I think that there's a new trend now that we embrace science in religion. Yeah, not only in Islam, but I think in Christianity as well, Buddhism and so on. So definitely, the potential is there. But I think we should pay attention to young ones because they are the one who's going to inherit the earth, from us. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Prof. Faridah and Dr. David Lloyd for your feedback. Now we have another question in the chat box. Dr. Faridah, can the current pandemic help the eco-literacy process? Because you can see many people began to plant trees at home during lockdown, and many also see that nature is getting better when the lockdown occurs. So hope for your response.
Yeah,
thank you.
Definitely. The pandemic is a reset. By Allah. For me, it's a reset by Allah, because then again, it's the cleansing of the earth. We see clearer water, purifying, purer air quality, and so on and so forth. And also personally, it gives us the space to self-reflect, right? How much is enough? Where do you go from here? After all these things that we acquire, wealth, money, and all that, what does it do when it comes to this, right? We can't even solve a virus problem. Where's the technology? Where's the super duper pharmaceutical advancement? It can't even solve until today. The vaccine that we have is not really a solution. So at the end of the day, it should ask us bigger questions. Who is prime force here, right? And what do you do with that kind of knowledge, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
David may want to respond to that as well.
Yeah.
David,
yes,
your
please.
thoughts?
I think you expressed that very well, Dr. Faridah, so I really don't have anything.
Right.
I mean, I can repeat it, but there's no point to that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, next question here in the chat box. Here is a question for both Dr. David Lloyd and Prof. Faridah. Do you think that our own religious institutions need to look at patterns of consumerism within our rituals, practices, and religious festivities? That's a question. So yeah, can we have Dr. David Lloyd to respond first? Because Prof. Faridah responded earlier. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think that's really important, isn't it? And that brings me back to something that the historical Buddha said. It's in the Pali Canon. He was very clear that we do not become awakened by following rituals. He really devalued rituals. Of course, he didn't allow animal sacrifices or anything like that, of course. But what he emphasized was the spiritual path is about genuine self-transformation in terms of how we relate to other people and relate to the world. There's a particularly wonderful story where I think a Hindu practitioner came to the Buddha and asked the Buddha, do you bathe in the river Bahula? Can't remember the name of the river, but do you bathe in the river? And the Buddha said, why should I bathe in the river? And the questioner said, well, if you bathe in the river, it will purify all your sins. It'll wash them away. And the Buddha said something like, oh, foolish man, how can bathing in the river wash away my sins? And if my mind is already transformed, why do I need to bathe in the river? What's the whole point of that? He was really critical of attachment to rituals. And I think that's something we really need to accept today. I mean, rituals can be very helpful in terms of sort of focusing our mind in a certain kind of way. But as I was trying to say in my talk, I think we really need to understand that our spiritual practice includes our engagement by ourselves and also with other people with doing whatever we can to make this world better for everyone. Let's not think of that ever as a distraction from our spiritual practice. More and more, it seems to me that's at the heart of it.
I think the guidance is already there in our books, yeah. But I think we need constant reminder. This is the problem. The Arabic term for men is anas, right? Which means those that forget easily. And that is a nature to us, to men. We forget easily. And therefore, the book, the guidance, Quran, Bible, whatever, are constant reminders. We have to be constantly reminded. For example, our practice in Ramadan. Ramadan is there to reduce, to help us think about those who have not, to share our food, to also cleanse the soul and so on and so forth. But what happens at breakfast, breaking fast? We overeat. I mean, in Malaysia, Ramadan is like a big festival. You know, the food bazaars and so on. And you take more than you do that on normal days. That's not the spirit of Ramadan. So I think it goes back to you internalizing your understanding of your own religion. Yeah, even prayers, you have to internalize why you do things. Yeah, in your prayer, in your Hajj, in your Ramadan and so on. Most people don't understand; they just follow. Yeah, it becomes a ritual. But the internalization of the value of the practice is often missed. So I think that's why the book is there. You know, we have to look at it in a more intellectual way as well when we read our Quran and our Bible. You know, to find out the real essence. Why does God want us to do certain things? I think this is what's lacking as well in our understanding of our own religion. That's my take on it, Sarina.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Nur Faridah and Dr. David Loy. So there's another question here in the chat box. All right, the last question, I assume, let's see here, is quite lengthy. So I type it in the PowerPoint and share here so you can see better. So, okay, Prof. David and Prof. Faridah, related to evolutionary narrative, how do you view this, which states that Homo sapiens have a survival tendency, not truth? How about Harari's thesis that evolution of man towards the Homo Deus level is the key to overcoming environmental problems? Thank you. Do I need to repeat the question again?
Can the person,
Yeah.
Can the person elaborate exactly? I mean, yeah.
Well,
it's a person. Hold on, let me see.
Nuruddin Al-Akbar. You want to elaborate further?
Yeah.
What you want to say here?
Turn on your microphone. Is Dr. Nuruddin here? Can you on your microphone? You may ask the questions directly to the speakers here.
Okay, all right. It's okay.
Oh, I can't.
Right.
Okay.
David, you want to respond to that first? I'm going to talk about fitrah, but maybe David wants to say something else.
Either way, but I'm happy to say a few words because actually,
go ahead.
Okay, this is of great interest to me. I've actually been studying evolutionary psychology, and I'm actually writing a book on that. That'll be my last book, I hope. But if we look at evolution simply in biological terms, we can see that it builds some negative things into us, unfortunately. It's like, for evolution, all that matters physically in terms of what gets your genes into the next generation. I think that sometimes there's an advantage, like greed and ill will and competition and such, that can actually encourage or sometimes help there, unfortunately. What is wonderful about what are called the axial age traditions, which include Islam, or the Abrahamic in general, and Buddhism, is that I think with those religions and the emphasis on universalism, universal love, universal compassion, basically what they are actually promoting is it's cultural evolution's way to help us overcome some of the problems that have been built into us by our physical, biological evolution. And that's one way to understand what our religions in part are doing. They are helping us compensate. It's like, as a result of evolution, we're a bit bipolar. There are selfish tendencies. There are also more selfless tendencies. And the Buddha was very clear in the Pali Canon that the path is about reducing, getting rid of the selfish and building on the more selfless, the more loving, the more compassionate. And so I think we can understand the cultural evolutionary process as something that's helping us address those kinds of problems built into us. I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to summarize a lot of stuff very quickly, but I'll have to leave it at that for the moment.
All right, I would like to bring in the concept of fitrah, the natural element in all of this, wanting to seek for the truth, right? So in Islam, before we were all before we are given birth, before we all been born, we already had a pact, yeah, in the other world, in the world of the Creator. And in that fact, we say that we will be truthful to you, and so on and so forth. And then rebirth. All right. And it depends on our environment and how we are shaped, but the fact remains within us. So the search for truth will always be there, right? But in terms of survival skill, we are all survivors. Otherwise, we will not be born, right? There's so many eggs and so on, but we survive. And when we survive and we are born, we are all given a sense of purpose in life, you know, what we call the calling. So it could be anything. The calling may be for you to become a preacher, to become a teacher, to help others, and so on. So that fitrah thing, we all live according to this fitrah, this calling. Yeah. So we will not be at peace until that calling matches your search. And that's why some people find peace when they discover certain religion and so on and so forth. Yeah, so I think from Islamic perspective, this fitrah thing is very, very important. This search for truth, the truth, right? The final truth. So you will keep on looking until you meet that truth. So life is a journey. That's why in Islam, we don't judge. When people kill, people do adultery, we don't judge them then. We pray for their transformation, that they will finally be shown the right path and the truth. So that's my take, Faridah.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. Faridah, and thank you, Dr. David Loy. Sadly, we have come to the end of topic 4. I would like to express my sincerest appreciation to the speakers, Prof. Dr. Faridah and Dr. David Loy, for their valuable contribution to Islam Buddhism Eco Dialogue IBED Conference 2022. Also, my deepest gratitude goes to all who attended this conference and helped make it such a successful event. Hearing and learning from the speakers as well as the audience has educated me and all of us here on how important it is to regularly reflect and ponder on our roles as the Caliph, the Earth Ambassador. I am certain that the takeaways from this conference will further deepen and stimulate our thinking work for the betterment of our future. With that, thank you. I'm Suhaila Muhammad signing off. And over to Mr. MC. Over to you. Thank you so much, Dr. David Loy and Prof. Dr.
Thank you, Suhaila, for wonderfully sharing it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Puan Suhaila Muhammad, and also our esteemed speakers, Professor Dr. Noor Faridah Abdul Manaf and Dr. David Loy, for such an insightful session full of practical approaches and personal advice on how we can each play our part to nurture the environment. Our next session will be topic 5, the role of civil societies in sustaining the Earth's ecological health, and will be held at 11 a.m. Malaysia time. The session speakers will be Mr. Muhammad Faisal Abdul Aziz, ABIM President, and Associate Professor Venerable Dr. Kamatashi Chodron from Malaysia, with moderator Mr. Wilson Ang. You may all stay logged into this meeting, and we will see you very shortly at 11 a.m. Thank you.